I'm going to share my screen. Close that. Okay, great. Stop. Perfect. Everybody can see that, I hope. I'm going to assume yes.
Yep. Looks good.
Perfect. Okay. So welcome everybody to March. It is already March. Those of us in Toronto, in Canada, are probably looking forward to some better weather, hopefully just around the corner. I don't care what groundhogs say. I always hope for the best. And so we are in March. I've got a little bit of housekeeping. I want to introduce our speaker really quickly and then hand off to him. But I've got a couple things to share. So I'm not sure how many people I've told about this, but I think it's something you'd really dig, and I'd love to get your feedback on it. So first is this 4x4 method of DevOps, which I've put together over the past couple months, basically combining the 4 key metrics from Dora and 4 maps that take the metrics or whatever metrics you want to track, whatever objective or outcome that you want to head towards, and map your way through the process of going from like, okay, we have this thing that we want, how are we going to get there? So it's a ebook that's pretty quick. It's full of all kinds of illustrations and diagrams and stuff like that. I hope you like it. So far, a lot of people dig it, so hoping you guys get a bunch of value from it. And the other one, the newer one, is this website that I put together to collect a bunch of value stream resources. So there's all kinds of open source tools. The latest one that I added was one from Brian Finster, which basically allows you to build out a value stream map in your browser and calculate all the numbers and basically do all the work for you, which will help a lot if you're looking at trying to see your process start to finish, whether it's software development or it's like your incident response process, whatever it is, customer onboarding, whatever you want to throw at it. It's a really easy way of kind of building that out and then measuring how it's performing. So check out both of those things. Let me know what you think. Thanks for the link, Sebastian. And with that, today we are going to be hearing from Daniel about service ownership. And this is an area that I'm really passionate about. I think that services and treating your services as really important pieces that need to be cared for and understood in the big picture and in the context of all the complexity that we deal with these days is pretty important. So really interested in hearing about that from Daniel. So that's going to be in a couple of minutes. But before we get to that, I want to introduce Ari, our generous sponsor for the year, and have him introduce what's the latest with JFrog.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate it. Well, happy 2021, everyone. Did you ever think it would get here? Well, we're here, and it doesn't quite look as different as we were all hoping, but I think we're headed there. I think we are all hoping for that right now. As Steve mentioned, my name is Ari Waller, and I'm the Meetup event manager for JFrog, and we're really excited to be part of the DevOps Toronto community for another year. I'll just share a little bit about who we are. JFrog is the DevOps software company known best for Artifactory, which is considered by many as the gold standard for managing your artifacts and dependencies. What a lot of people, though, don't know about JFrog yet is that we now offer a free cloud subscription for you to use for your projects. And you can even attend one of our hands-on workshops that will teach you how to use it for free. Also, if you look at the slide, especially on the right side, if you work with Docker images, which I'm sure many of you do, in Docker Hub, our free tier service includes the capability of serving as a proxy cache. And the best part is, because of the partnership with Docker that we signed at the end of January, by using the JFrog free tier, you'll bypass the Docker Hub rate limits for anonymous access. So I know that can be pretty valuable. And I'll drop a note on that in the chat shortly. But just as fun, especially for me, as you can see, I'm a big Lego fan, and this is my Baby Yoda. You too can have a Baby Yoda. So for tonight, JFrog's going to give you a chance to enter to win a Lego Baby Yoda. You can enter it with the QR code or the bit.ly link that you see, and I will drop that in the chat. And a winner is going to be selected in 2 business days, and then we will share the winners on the meetup page and on social media. I wish I could do a live drawing, but corporate compliance doesn't allow me to do that. But what I will assure you is it is a random pick, and it will also be shared. The winner will be shared with the entire community. So with that being said, I just want to thank you again, Steve. Really looking forward to the talk this evening. And thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks, Ari. Before I switch over to Daniel, I just want to let you guys know that we are talking about performance feedback next month. So Amber's going to join us and share tips and tricks about how to drive proper feedback with our teams. And I think that's especially important now that we have a new format for all of that. Right now, all of that is happening online. So figuring out how to do that the best way possible online and remotely, I think is really important. So if you're looking for a career boost and getting better, getting more out of your job and getting better outcomes from collaboration and teamwork, leadership, if you're looking to move into leadership or gain more seniority in your organization, I think it's really important. So look forward to that. And with that, I'm going to flip back to Daniel and hand over the reins.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
No problem.
Cool. What should I aim for timing wise? You can make something up. That's fine.
Yeah, well, half an hour is probably perfect.
Okay, yeah, that works good. Okay, cool. All right, thanks everybody for hanging out. Thanks for having me. Just maybe a little quick introduction about me. So I'm a co-founder at this company called Lightstep. I'm the chief architect there. Before I joined and started Lightstep, I was an engineer at Google. I worked in Google's infrastructure and cloud platform teams. I worked pretty closely with SRE. I carried a pager for a lot of years, and I like to think that I learned a bunch of stuff, both through osmosis and sometimes failure. But so today is like basically learning from a bunch of that experience, both time at Google, time at Lightstep, and from some other folks that I've talked with over the years. And it's really about kind of merging, I guess, some of the technical and the information that we have, the data that we have, with processes and things around accountability and ownership. I'm also the author of Distributed Tracing in Practice, which is one of the reasons I'm going to talk about tracing. I mean, tracing I think is pretty important and something I've been thinking about for a long time. And then just a few other things about me. I grew up across the lake in Rochester, New York. So this is not exactly the view from Rochester, but sort of the view from Rochester. And now I live in San Francisco, so this is a tower that I stare at more frequently. So to get started, I should just define what I mean by service ownership. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways I think of doing DevOps, and even service ownership can be done in a bunch of ways. But my version of it anyway is that developer teams are responsible for the delivery of software and the service that software provides. So it's not just that they're writing the code, but they're carrying pagers, they're thinking about cost and optimization, they're thinking about capacity planning. At Google, at times this was done by SRE, or the SRE organization, but it turns out, maybe some of you know this as well, but SRE was sort of like a luxury that some teams had in many ways. And a lot of teams that I worked on, they were still responsible for all these things. We could get SRE to come in and give us some advice, but we were still stuck carrying the pager and things like that. And I think the reason why we want to take on that additional responsibility is that ideally that gives us some independence. So each of those teams can make decisions about how they're working, they can move faster. And because they can make their own decisions, they can get better outcomes in that. So maybe, a team that's working on really critical transaction stuff can slow the process down a little bit, can be worried a little bit more about reliability. A team that's working on a recommendation service or something like that, where there's maybe not one right answer, can experiment a little bit more freely, move a little more quickly. Maybe downtime's not as big of a deal to them, or maybe they're just going to do more experiments. So if that's our goal, what are the obstacles to getting there? One of them is that you can't have that independence without clear responsibilities and goals. So you just can't tell them what they're supposed to be doing if you don't give them a target. And I think maybe that's obvious. One part that's a little bit more subtle is that not only do you need to make sure that all of your developer teams have clear goals, but you need to be able to measure them in consistent ways. And that's really important for that autonomy to scale. Otherwise, as maybe someone in the DevOps org or the SRE org, you're going to be spending a ton of time just kind of going around and checking in with everyone and figuring out how well they're doing. And so you want to be able to automate that process in some way. And the last part is that if this is a change, which I think it is for a lot of organizations, where they're maybe moving from a more siloed operations team to a more distributed ownership model, is that you're going to meet a lot of resistance in trying to make that change, unless you also give teams some agency in how they do that. So if you take away only 3 things, this is the cheat slide or whatever, if you're going to take a screenshot or whatever, like Steve said. So the first one is, I think when people hear the word ownership, they think a lot about accountability or responsibility. Like, I'm getting ownership of this thing, I'm accountable for it. But I think it's equally important to think about the word agency, that you actually have control as well, in addition to responsibility. And that means the agency to improve things, to improve how the work is done. Part of this, I guess, collision or synergy, if you want, between the people and the data is really going to be around distributed tracing. If we're going to get distributed ownership, we need to be able to tie different pieces of the stack together. And then kind of the bulk of what I want to talk about today is sort of 3 examples of how distributed tracing can play a role in service ownership. And those are through documentation, through the on-call process itself, and through SLOs. I should say also, I'm happy to answer questions in the middle of this if folks want to jump in either in chat or whatever, that's fine. Or we can wait till the end. Doesn't matter to me. Okay, so I just want to do a quick refresher on distributed tracing in case this is not something that folks are familiar with. If you've used a distributed tracing tool, it maybe looks like this or like one of these things. They all have kind of like a Gantt chart-like feel to them, right? So the idea is you're showing the way that individual requests are processed by your application, and time goes from left to right. And then as you go from the top to the bottom, you're going from the top of the stack down to the bottom of the stack. So you might have, what your mobile app or your browser is doing at the top, or maybe your load balancer. And as that passes through, your API server and different things that are happening below that, all the way maybe down to the database layer. And the idea is you can look at those and try to get a sense of what's happening and where the dependencies are, where there might have been a long time spent processing that request, where errors occurred, where there was maybe a mismatch between the API parameters and what was expected, something like that. What I want to say though is that those traces, like looking at those individual Gantt chart-like things, that's really just the raw material of what you can do with tracing. They're just the structs, and I think tracing itself is really about deriving value from those things. I guess this is like a thing that I try to say in a lot of different contexts, not just about tracing. Is like, as we're thinking about this data, like the data as maybe like the nerds of DevOps, like the data is pretty exciting to us, I think, because we see the value that it could provide. But for a lot of folks that are maybe not breathing it as much as we are, it's not so clear what that value is. And so I think it's worth calling out like how that data is used, what it's going to actually do in terms of your organization, your business. I'm not going to say too much more about tracing. If you want to look, the Dapper paper is a white paper that Google wrote, and one of my colleagues was an author on, but basically described the way that Google did this, which one, maybe we shouldn't all just do what Google did. That's absolutely true. And B, or two, I guess, it was actually describes work that was done more than 15 years ago now. So it's a little bit old, but I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is it actually influenced a lot of the open source work that was done in tracing afterwards. So you can sort of see the beginnings of that kind of thing, whether that's something like Zipkin or Jaeger. And the second thing is that they actually spent a lot of time talking about how the data was used. So it was used to do these aggregate analyses of web search latency. It was used to do things like capacity planning. Like it was used for a lot of stuff besides for just looking at those graphs. Our book has a bunch of this stuff too, which I think is obviously a good resource. And I guess if you're interested in learning more, I would definitely say check out OpenTelemetry. OpenTelemetry is Cloud Native Computing Foundation project that basically pulls together an SDK, a set of APIs, and even the beginnings of a data pipeline for collecting this kind of telemetry, including traces from your application. But I guess I just want to say this one more time, like the traces kind of fit down here in the bottom of the way that I think about the anatomy of observability, and you know, metrics and logs are also important. But again, this is really like the beginning of the story in a lot of ways. And I guess maybe you can think of this whole talk as like ways of deriving value from that data. But I think maybe this is sort of separate advice about bringing these kinds of new tools or thinking about sort of upgrading tools in this space, is like really thinking about not just the fact that you have a great metrics tool, but thinking about the value you're going to get from that. Cool. Cool. Yeah, I should say also, my first name is Daniel, but I've worked for a lot of Daniels, so everybody calls me Spoons. So yeah, if that comes up, or if I don't respond to Dan at first, that's probably, I think you're talking about one of the other ones around here. Okay, so let's talk about building service ownership. I had these three pieces that I think of. They're not the only parts of service ownership, but they're sort of three kind of important parts of this sort of trivial puzzle, I guess. And I guess when I say service ownership, I think a lot of people jump right to on-call as like incident response, like that's what service ownership is all about. And I understand that's like a deeply emotional part of being a service owner for a lot of folks. But I actually think that documentation is a better place to start in a lot of ways, because you can do documentation before you start passing the pager around. And I'll talk a bit about, I think, why that's important. So this is a little bit story of how we sort of did service ownership at Lightstep. Lightstep started as, you know, 3 founders sitting around writing code, slacking each other from 6 feet away or whatever. And as we grew, you know, we had the case where not everyone was an expert in all the pieces of the system anymore. So we started to build out a wiki of what our services were and information that folks needed to know about those. And that was really sort of, to me, the beginning of service ownership, really trying to catalog that expertise. And so, you know, we built this wiki. You could find dashboards, you could find alert definitions and playbooks, things like that. One piece of advice for this that I would say is start with a template. That actually lets you do a bunch of cool stuff. Like you can actually pull out interesting pieces of that. You can actually ask questions about your documentation. You can say things like, well, how is expertise distributed across my organization? Does one person show up for expert for 80% of the services or not? It's easy to kind of pull that data and see how it changes over time. You can look at things like last modified dates. You can build a process around keeping this information up to date. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges with documentation, especially for something like software that's changing a lot, is doing that. And it's an easy way to automate a process of periodic updates. It's not you that has to bug people every quarter to update it. Like you can automate that process. From here, kind of the next step, I think, is actually not only to make it something that you can sort of is machine readable once a quarter or something like that, but actually make it machine readable all the time. So there's still a wiki. We still have that describes some parts of our system, but many parts of our of service ownership and of our service documentation is actually now in a YAML file. So this is kind of a tiny snippet of our services.yaml. And it's not just used for these offline processes like doing an audit or answering random questions that a founder has about how ownership or expertise is distributed, but it's actually used to generate things like our dashboards. It's used to generate our pipeline configuration. So it's actually not possible to deploy a service to production in Lightstep without putting that service in this YAML file. And so now we know that, well, that YAML file has every important service in it because those are the services, right? That's where our CI/CD pipeline config comes from. So this kind of goes from making it like a nice to have to making it a necessary part of folks' day-to-day work. And that will basically mean that it has to be up to date. And this is where we record things like owners and a bunch of other aspects of sort of key parts of the services themselves. And then I think the other thing that can be hard is like often, documentation can talk about a service in isolation, but services don't run in isolation. They have dependencies. They have interactions with other part of your application. And so the other way to keep things up to date is just to not try to do it, is to use the data from your application to do that. So I guess this is to say, like, thinking about where in your documentation, where in your sort of service catalog, where is it that you can have humans provide the highest value? Great, have those parts of it still be parts that are human written. But for things that you can actually derive from the telemetry, you can derive from the traces, have those be automatically driverless. Don't try to ask humans to keep the list of dependencies up to date. You can just use the data to do that. And it's actually, once you've done it for one level of dependency, you can do it for many levels of dependency. And this is great for things like onboarding, right? To show how things interact with each other. And it's great for showing things like how reliable are systems and how reliable are your dependencies as well. So maybe I don't have to be telling any of you why documentation is important, but if you're going to start service ownership, you have to record who owns things. So that's sort of the first part of it. And this is a way to do it in a way that's transparent so everybody can see it. You can automate a bunch of stuff with good documentation. You can train new people. And I think maybe for us at Lightstep, this was really an important step in building our team's confidence. Like I'm sure you all work with great people too. Like they want to do a good job, right? Like they don't want to take the pager if they don't think that they can answer that page at 3 a.m. And so documentation is really a way for you to help build that confidence and help ease the transition to a more distributed ownership of things. So cool. So I am going to talk about on-call. Obviously, on-call is important. On-call actually means a lot of different things in organizations that I've been part of. So obviously, on-call is responsible for incident response. And often as part of that, they're responsible for communicating status internally and maybe externally as well. On some teams I've been on, they're also responsible for change management. So they might push new code, or they might just be kind of air traffic control and be a gate for other people pushing code, often pushing infrastructure changes. They also might be doing a bunch of more passive work, like looking at dashboards, or less urgent interrupt-driven work, like alert triage and customer requests. And then last, there's a bunch of important communication aspects of on-call, I think, that we can't forget, which is we have to transition to the next shift. We have to hand off that information, and we have to do things like write postmortems. So the first, I think, piece of moving towards service ownership is actually establishing a need for distributed service ownership. So this was a question that came up a bunch of times at Lightstep and on other teams that I've been on, is just, we have something that's working okay. Why should we change it, right? We have one on-call rotation. Why should we move to 2? So I guess, the things that I have used in the past is to establish that need is to actually ask people, like to run surveys at the end of an on-call shift, ask people, whether or not they had the information they felt like they needed, whether or not they felt confident in their work as an on-call engineer. You can also look at less subjective things like response time and the number of people that get pulled into an incident. And then as you think about breaking apart, like I mentioned, documentation, but making sure as you split things that you're distributing expertise across the different rotations, and trying to get a good balance between the size of the rotation and the number of services. Part of the reason we broke things up at one point was actually because it was just too long between folks being on call. And not only would the system change a lot, but they just forget how everything worked. And so by actually making the rotation size smaller, people were more comfortable with what was going on. So let's see. So handling alerts. I'm not going to say too much about this. I mean, I hope it's clear. I'm happy to talk more about why I think distributed traces can be really helpful in doing things like root cause analysis. One thing I think is actually interesting that I saw from someone in the community is they actually use distributed tracing to deliver alerts to the right teams. So this is something that's deployed at Zalando, which is a big European e-commerce firm. And so this is stuff that was presented by Luis Monero at SRECon a couple of years ago. But I was going to give you all the gist of it, which is, you want to monitor on symptoms, right? You want to page on user-facing behaviors of your application. And in this case, maybe that's a checkout. That's the e-commerce example, right? So if you're seeing errors in checkout service, that's something that you want to page someone for. But what they found is that a lot of the time, the checkout service was actually not the team that was responsible for the actual problem. Like that was definitely nothing that they could do to actually fix the problem besides try to find another team. And this actually happened to me on one of the teams I worked on at Google. My team was responsible for the API just below the Cloud Console. And the Cloud Console is meant to give you this very uniform view of the cloud platform. It's like you've got all these different products, but they're so nicely integrated. Everything is seamless. At least that's the appearance we're trying to give you. But when in fact, it's like 27 different teams with their own roadmaps, and they're geographically distributed, and they've got 7 years of technical debt, or they're 2 years since their launch, or 2 months. Anyway, the point is that we were caught in the middle all the time. We would get paged, and it was almost never our fault. In fact, I remember being on call once, and I got paged, and I started grepping through a bunch of logs, and kind of figured out that it was probably the billing team. So I got someone from the billing team on chat. I was trying to explain what was going on, why I thought it was their fault, and then hold on, I got to go. I'm getting paged. I was like, I know you're getting paged. I'm trying to tell you something's broken. That's why we're here. So what the folks at Zalando did is basically just automate that. So they collect a bunch of traces whenever they would see this burst of errors, and they would basically follow dependencies within those traces. So they see errors in checkout service, they look at all the dependencies of checkout service. Which of those have errors? Okay, that's the order service. Okay, let's look at all the dependencies of the order service. Which of those have errors? Oh, the accounting service. Let's look at all the dependencies of accounting service that have errors. Oh, there are none. Okay, well, let's stop there. Let's page accounting service and tell them that there's a problem with checkout, because we think that they're actually a lot more likely to actually be able to fix this problem. And what we've done there is not only, get someone on the scene much more quickly. Like we don't have to go through several different rotations to get someone that can actually fix the problem. We've probably saved a whole bunch of people some sleep. So again, thinking about how we can automate that process. And I wish that we had this sort of thing when I was at Google, because it would have saved me some sleep. The other thing, I guess, that is important here is giving teams that agency, like I said, to change the way that this works. So one of the things as we split up service ownership is it turned out that there was a bunch of alerts that were useful to someone at some point, but they weren't part of the new rotation. And so giving the new rotation the flexibility to just delete stuff that they didn't think was going to be useful. And then, giving those teams, giving them the flexibility to change the structure that to fit their sprint schedule. Maybe this team does 1 week sprints, maybe they do 2 week sprints. They may want to change the rotation in some way. Maybe they got a lot of people that would rather do evenings than they would weekends, whatever it is, let them make that decision. The last part I think that I wanted to touch on for OnCall is just around postmortems, and that's really about how do we do better next time, right? And that's both ensuring that we fix the issues that caused the problem, but also making sure that we do a good job in responding to issues next time. And they are a form of documentation, right? So maybe the first rule of all documentation is make it easy, right? Like help people get over that bar quickly. Make sure they're in a central place where everyone can find them, and then make sure that those action items are there in a way that can be captured in a structured way. And of course, leverage telemetry where you can in that, right? I think, I guess I've seen a bunch of uses where, part of the postmortem is two teams arguing about, not whose fault it was, but, who could have done something differently to prevent this, or who wasn't meeting their contract. And having some telemetry really, at Google, this came up a bunch where, you could sort of measure latency from both sides. And it seemed like everything was okay, but the telemetry was really a way for us to hit ground truth and really move past those, I guess, disagreements about whose fault it was to actually trying to solve the problem in some way. One thing that we've done at Lightstep trying to make this easy is we have a thing called the tiny postmortem, which is, I think, we have a postmortem template too, and it has a 5 different sections and there's a timeline and all these different pieces. I feel like for a lot of smaller incidents that maybe, are not customer affecting, that seems like a big thing to try and start. And so we try to kind of cover the other end of the spectrum through this form. And it's really just, I think it's like 5 questions. They're almost all multiple choice. And the idea is just like anytime anything happens that you have to do something in production, whether that's just looking at dashboards to make sure everything's all right, or rolling back a release or something like that to fill this out. And then, we have a lot more data about how we can do that. And, of course, for larger, bigger incidents, we do a more detailed process, but having an option sort of at the low end of the spectrum is pretty useful too. Okay, I probably don't have to argue why OnCall is important to all of you. Like, it has a direct impact on customer experience. The time that's spent handling pages is time not doing other more productive things, including sleeping, and stress of OnCall can have a major impact on job satisfaction. So that's a thing that is important in terms of things like retention and just on the job happiness. So I mentioned holding teams accountable and setting goals for them. How do we do that? So the last part of what I want to talk about is setting service level objectives. Maybe you all have seen these things. I was going to do a little refresher and then talk about how I think about using tracing and setting these up. But just to cover the basics, like a service level objective is a way of describing the goals of what services should do. So that's really about establishing what are the expectations for your customers or for services customers. And those might be external to your organization, like actual users, or they might be other services within your organization. And the idea is here, within that expectation is you have some threshold that lets you determine whether or not you succeeded or failed, and that you can measure that over time or over groups of events, depending on how you want to measure it exactly. But I like to think about it over time. And then it provides a way of communicating about how reliable service is. So as you're planning sprints, as you're planning work over the next quarter, how close you are to meeting or missing your objectives can be a useful tool. It can be a useful tool with communicating with people in product or communicating with management. And just to give a concrete example, a service level objective might look something like this. It might say that you want to keep 99th percentile latency below 5 seconds over the last 5 minutes. So you've got sort of 3 parts of this. First, you've got the service level indicator, which is just, it's a metric or a time series. It's something that you can measure either, again, over time or as a series of events. There's some threshold. That's our objective, right? And then we have a measurement window that tells us something about how we're measuring that. And I guess if SLOs are new to you and you take only one thing, really the main thing I would hope that you take away is just that you should be aiming for less than perfect. Perfect is really expensive, and both from a money and an effort point of view. And so that can be that you're aiming for 3 nines or 2.5 nines or 98.2%. Like, it doesn't have to be some number of nines, but it's about how often you're actually meeting this goal. And it's okay not to meet it all the time. It's not true. Oh, okay. Some common indicators a lot of people use are things like latency or error rate, but it can be specific to the way your application works. It could be something around, number of video buffer misses or something like that, whatever sort of makes sense for you. It could be something much more application specific around things like checkout if you want as well. Okay. So again, SLOs are how you set goals for teams, how you determine whether or not they're doing a good job. And again, this kind of goes back to things like deleting alerts, to setting on-call time to keyboard and things like that. It's a way for teams to judge how well they're doing, so they don't have to feel like they have to do perfect, like they have a concrete goal that they can aim for. So, okay, so they're a good idea. How do we determine them? Well, you can ask your customers what they expect. You can look at sort of business metrics over time. You can understand whether or not people drop off of your site if you're too slow or if you provide too many errors. You can look at things like lost revenue and what's meaningful to your business. You should probably also look at how you're performing today. I wouldn't suggest setting goals that are much faster than what's there, because you're not going to meet them. And then you should also think a little bit about what's going to change. Like, maybe you have a big event coming up, whether that's Black Friday or tax season or who knows what. And if you expect big things coming up, maybe give yourself a little more cushion in terms of how that's happening. Yeah, P99 is short for 99th percentile. Basically, in latency, we often look at measuring the slowest set of requests. So that's setting a threshold for the 1% of requests that are the slowest. I'm happy to, there's a bunch of good reasons why you might want to think about that, but rather than something like median or average. But yeah, thanks for the question and the clarification. Okay, so this is how you might determine them for your users, right? You can ask them or you can measure that. But what about for internal services, right? You've just divided service ownership among a bunch of teams. Not all of those teams actually have external customers. Some of them are internal. That's where something like tracing comes in. So imagine we have this pretty simple setup here. So we have these three services, A and B and C. A depends on B, B depends on C. And we know from talking to our customers that we want to keep the 99th percentile latency below 5 seconds. That is, we want to make sure 99% of requests are satisfied faster than 5 seconds. How does this translate to SLOs for these other two services? That's the question that we're trying to answer. So, as I said, you probably want to look at more than one trace, not just one. But I'm just going to show one for this example here. Pretend this is like a set of traces that all kind of look the same. And the idea here is that service A mostly calls into service B, doesn't do much on its own. And service B makes 2 calls into service C to handle some parts of the request. And it seems to be doing those in series. And so that's important. So given that, we can kind of, at least back of the envelope, say that we have to set a similar threshold for service B as we did for service A. Maybe we have to make it a little bit tighter to account for communication between them and some other overhead, but like ballpark, 99th percentile latency also needs to be below 5 seconds. Now for service C, it's a little bit trickier. First pass, maybe you think, well, there's 2 of them, so we only have 5 seconds. So one way is we have to divide that in half. So each of those 2 requests have to be less than 2.5 seconds. There's other ways that you can divide it if you want. This is actually not quite right, because remember, what we want to do in this is we want to account for the fact that we're going to fail sometimes. And so if we make 2 requests to C, there's actually 2 opportunities for C to fail to meet that threshold. And again, there's a couple of ways of doing the math here, but roughly what that means is that we actually, not only does C have to be faster in the sense that we have 5 seconds, we have to do 2 requests. They both have to be, on average, less than 2.5 seconds. But they actually have to do that more frequently. So we need actually 99.5% of requests to fit within 2.5 seconds. And that's something that, just looking at the dependency graph itself, we can't see. We have to actually understand the structure of what's happening there and how those requests are actually being passed through. The last part of this is that maybe service B also depends on a 4th service, on service D in some other cases. But in this particular case, we don't have any information to help us understand what an SLO for D might look like, because for these requests coming from service A, there's no actual flow to service D. So we have to look somewhere else if we want to figure that out. Cool. So why are SLOs important? They are really the way that we measure success in delivering service. They're both a way that, from a management or from a reporting point of view, we can look at how well teams are doing, but it's also useful for those teams to guide prioritizing their own work. And I guess back to one of the points I was making earlier is if you're trying to distribute ownership across the organization, you need to do that in a uniform way if you want it to scale. And SLOs are a very, flexible but clean way of holding folks accountable to those goals, a way that you can measure easily and that you can report on in a uniform way. Okay, so just to kind of review, so there's 3 pieces of this. So documentation, that's key in establishing ownership, who you're going to hold accountable. But I think one of the challenges in documentation is keeping it up to date, not just for things like service owners, but for a lot of things. I talked to organizations actually where they tried to do this. They documented things, and then folks would leave the company, but they're still listed as owners. Then you have to have some process for like how it goes to someone else on their team, but maybe the team's disbanded, so maybe it goes to their manager, although their manager is in a different part of the org now. Like keeping these things up to date, if you don't, you're just going to make a bunch of pain for yourself. And so making that documentation not just a static thing, but that's actually used every day, every hour as part of something like dashboard configuration or pipeline, CI/CD pipeline configuration is really important. And then using tracing and other kinds of telemetry to augment that documentation so that it doesn't have to be humans that keep it up to date. OnCall, it's, I think, more than just incident response. It's more than just what do you do when you get paged and what are the tools that you have to do that. But using the documentation and the telemetry as ways of automating parts of that process, as ways of communicating about what's happening. And then finally, SLOs, I think, pretty important in terms of how we communicate and measure success. And again, understanding the structure of your application, how the software all fits together, is pretty important for that. And telemetry can really drive that and help determine what some of those goals should be. So I think this is my last slide. So as I said kind of at the beginning, I think when people hear the word ownership, they think a lot about responsibility and accountability. But if you want to help distribute that ownership in your organization, really think about agency as well. So that's not just setting goals for people, but giving them the information they need, the confidence they need, and the budget, both maybe time and money, to actually improve the process that they have, to improve the documentation, to improve the tools that they use to understand that. And then what I guess I hope you take away is that tracing provides some key information for both of these, both in terms of how we hold people accountable and how we give them the information to make things better. So that's all I got. Happy to chat, take some questions, hear people's stories about trying to do this in their own organizations or having it, I guess, done to them. Also happy to follow up on Twitter, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Daniel, for awesome presentation. I have a question. How would you include the SLO projects and services which are dependent from your, but they are not blocked for you? For example, you're making an API call, and during processing of this API call, you forward some data for another service, and you is not blocked by response by this service, but you still have to provide data for this third-party service. And there's also can be some errors, issues, and how would you include this to SLO, and should they include it to SLO at all?
So if I understand correctly, this is thinking about the SLO for one of your dependencies that is maybe asynchronous in some, or that the result of that is asynchronous.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
That's a good question. I guess off the top of my head, maybe the kind of process I described in terms of tracing is less useful, or maybe it's useful to understand that you're not going to be able to simply pass sort of SLOs through in a way, because you don't need them maybe to meet the same level of latency. Maybe something more just looking over long time windows. I guess what would happen if I get, maybe this is the word, what would happen to the service that you have to provide if that service didn't actually process your requests over the next minute or the next 5 minutes or the next 10 minutes or the next 24 hours? At what point does a failure from that service impact the service that you're asked to provide? Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you so much.
Daniel, here's a question that I always like to ask. Where do you see this going? Like, what are the things that you see on the horizon that you're excited about, or where do you see the most momentum here?
Yeah, let's see, what am I excited about? I guess, one thing that I'm excited about is I feel like I've been working on Lightstep stuff for 6 years now, and at the beginning we were doing tracing, and tracing was a pretty niche thing, and I know it's something that still a lot of people are learning about, but it's definitely a lot more widely understood now, I think. And I think that's pretty cool in itself, but I guess I'm excited about just integrating different kinds of data together. I guess this is a little bit just my philosophy on how to think about running production systems, but to try to break down silos between different kinds of information. That's exciting. Where do I think it's going? I think SLOs are maybe still a little new for a lot of people, but it's pretty exciting to me that we maybe this is all just about like scaling DevOps or scaling an SRE organization. I think, I have always really enjoyed kind of being, I guess, on both sides, like thinking about how to build more reliable services. And it's fun to talk with people about it, but it's also like, I guess, recognizing that in, an organization with 1,000 engineers, I'm not going to be able to sit down and talk with all of them. And so thinking about kind of the evolution of these tools where, whether they're, actual tools like tracing or conceptual tools like SLOs as ways to kind of scale that so that I don't have to sit down with all those 1,000 people. That's exciting to me. So I think, there's still a long ways to go, I guess. I feel like in that kind of scaling, but that's exciting to me.
I have a question, Daniel. So basically, I did a very detailed assessment for my enterprise when we were looking for observability tools. So if you allow me, just want to show one screen. So maybe I just want to validate my understanding, and we evaluated your tool as well. So let me know how many minimum tools an enterprise can have, and we can cover all the pillars of observability.
Sure, though I guess I should warn you, I have some opinions about pillars.
Yeah, let me just quickly share my screen. So this was the exercise which I did. Okay, so if you just look at if my screen is loaded, I can just quickly share you guys. Is my screen visible?
Yeah.
So if you see, we have so many tools already in the enterprise. So we have Splunk, so we have AppDynamic, we have Dynatrace. So many things were there. And the leadership wanted that how many minimum tool with the minimum budget we can have, and we can cover everything. And this research itself took a lot of time because we have so many use cases which we started with, and then we detailed through every tools what they are providing, and then finally we stuck to basically 3 tools to cover these pillars. One was the Splunk for a log aggregation, and then we took one of the tool as an APM tool, like we took Dynatrace. But I just want to know, like, is there any way, is there any study which we can use, and what minimum tool do you think that can be useful? Because this was our assessment. What do you think about this, that whether Splunk and Dynatrace can fulfill all the 3 pillars, or is there any other way also?
Yeah, so I think, let me see, I'm going to tell some, I hate to tell too many Google stories, but part of this idea of these 3 pillars, I think kind of came from Google and Twitter, that they said, okay, well, we've got like a logs tool, a metrics tool, and a tracing tool. So that's probably what other people need. Honestly, like the tracing tool at Google, like it wasn't used by most engineers. And I think the reason for that is it's actually kind of hard to find. Like the biggest thing that we did to get people to use it is that like there was already a dashboard for like the cluster management system, so you could go look at your workload. And we added a link to that took you into the tracing system, and that like caused the like 100x increase in the usage of the tracing tool. And so I guess the thing I took from that is like, it wasn't about whether or not we had a tracing tool, because like no one, or very few, there was a few expert users, I guess, that were asking for it and were excited about it. But most engineers, they weren't saying like, oh, I need a tracing tool. There was one there, they just weren't using it. They didn't know to look for it or know that they needed it. It was more like they had a use case in mind, and that by connecting the data that we had with a workflow that they were already familiar with, then they were able to meet the needs of that use case. So I guess this is kind of a long way of saying, kind of going back, it's like, I guess I wouldn't try to classify the use cases into like a tracing tool or a metrics tool or not. There's a chapter in the book about how all these things are kind of fungible. Like you can, almost all these tools will do this in some way anyway. You can take logs and you can derive metrics from them, right? Or like tracing is just kind of a special case of logging where you have information about dependencies within it. It's important, but at some level, it's also just another kind of structured log. You can derive metrics from traces as well. So again, yeah, I guess I wouldn't think of it like these are boxes that I have to check. It's more like, what is actually going to be used by teams for incident response? What's going to be used by teams to do maybe root cause analysis or things like that? what are the tools that are going to be used by teams to assess health? And that's probably through a dashboard. Okay, well, a dashboard is a use case, but that again can be, you can use any of these things to make dashboards, right? So I guess I would go back to like, yeah, what, and maybe this is a long answer, but like, what are the use cases that you're trying to solve for? And I don't think that the people that are going to have those use cases think about these three categories. So
okay, so
yeah.
basically another challenge that we saw was we are in a client server model where I'm part of a pharmacy chain, and we have pharmacy sending data to the central system. And when we enable these kind of things, logs, metrics, and tracing, so it actually incur a lot of load onto the traffic as well. So if I enable metrics, so it will every 35 seconds, it will send the pulse. So if I have a central system, so it will chalk my traffic for the business flow. So how to deal with these kind of situation? Because tracing itself is adding a lot of volume.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess maybe part of the answer to this is I think that these data, I mean, metrics is a thing that term could be applied to operational needs. You could also talk about, my marketing team has like metrics that they're talking about, right? When we're talking about operational work, I think the constraints on the data volume, on the value of that data are pretty different than a lot of other like business analytics use cases. And so I guess to me, this is like part of the idea is maybe there's a tool that's a great log aggregation tool for doing, BI or for doing, like security logging or compliance logging or something like that. It actually might not be a great tool, even though the API kind of looks like the right shape. It might not be a great tool for doing operational logging because as you're saying, you might just log a lot of data and you don't actually want to keep all of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I think this comes up a lot in tracing because people talk about sampling as a way to address that problem. And there's a bunch of stuff in both the Dapper paper and the book about how to think about sampling. But yeah, I guess maybe that's just to say like, you're absolutely hitting on a real problem, and whatever you're doing is probably going to have to be specific to these operational needs, and you're not, sorry, going to be able to throw a kind of generic tool at it. Like, I don't know, I don't want to pick on anyone, but you shouldn't be using like BigQuery or something like that to do operational stuff. You can, it's just expensive.
Yeah, in fact, we are moving to a custom solution also, where we will be running a Spring Boot application in the store, which will be picking the specific things and will be dumping in a JSON or some file, and that will be transported to Splunk so that there's no network congestion. Even from the bigger logs, we are grabbing the valuable things. Only those things will be sent to the central place. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
In the chat, I saw a couple of things. The book I keep mentioning, sorry, I'm just plugging my own book. Maybe I shouldn't do that, but it's Distributed Tracing in Practice. It was published by O'Reilly last year. I feel less bad plugging it because we donated all the royalties to a nonprofit. Really, it's just like for me about building awareness around tracing. So I don't know, you can go to O'Reilly or wherever you buy books these days and get a copy. But we tried, it's actually, basically one of the tracing experts from Twitter, an academic at Max Planck Institute in Germany, who's an expert in tracing. And then one of my colleagues at Lightstep and I sat down and wrote this and tried to cover from like, how do you get started with tracing, open source solutions, thinking about cost, sampling, thinking about how do you get value from this, what are the use cases, and then a bunch of stuff kind of about the future of tracing. The other thing I saw in chat, I guess unless Steve tells me to shut up, I'm going to talk for a minute or two, but
you can have a minute.
Okay.
We just hit 6, but go ahead.
The multiple logging levels is good. I think the thing that's tricky in this that I've seen is like the logs from one service, which might not be that interesting, can actually be pretty useful to another service. So like service A depends on service B. Service B's logging, everything's so cool. Don't turn up the logging. I'm just doing fine. Turns out that like service B deployed something that changed some functionality that service A was depending on. And now service A is freaking out. And like knowing that service B thinks everything is fine is actually pretty important, because now you can kind of trace that back to this rollout or something like that. So I guess it's a little bit tricky, I feel like, to think about, I guess this is why I would say like where tracing brings more value to logging, because we're actually connecting these things and we can use what fails in one place to help isolate what can help us understand that in another place. But that's just my pitch for tracing. So
that brings me to something that I think about all the time, which is basically like starting from outcomes, right? Like, I think it speaks to that, and it speaks to this question of how do we choose a tool, or how do we choose tools? It's really like, you've got to think of like, what is the outcome you're looking for? Are you looking to get faster? Are you looking to improve quality? Are you looking to keep visibility on everything so nothing falls through the cracks? Like, starting from outcomes is going to inform strategy. It's going to inform choices. It's going to align everybody's perspectives. It's going to make all that stuff make sense and make those decisions easier. So that's what I would suggest, is taking a step back and saying, okay, well, wait a second. Like, before we try and choose a tool that does everything that we want, do we know why we want to do the things that we want, and what those things that we want to do are connected to? Because that's going to take that like evaluating every tool in the universe and trying to distill it down to like one tool that does everything, and then that doesn't do the thing that you actually wanted to do in the first place exercise, which I've seen many, many times before and I've been a part of. So that's one thing that I always come back to. I will never stop playing that tune. But and that's one thing I will leave everybody with is think about outcomes and think about what you're trying to do, especially when you're thinking about distributed tracing and service ownership. Like, what's the goal? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to make people's evenings free of pages? Are you trying to improve quality, lower response times, whatever it is? Use that to frame your approach. And with that, I will see everybody next month. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Spoons. This was excellent. And we really appreciate you sharing the knowledge and sharing the experience.
Yeah, thanks everybody.